doing?
How are you? You just arrived, right?
I just arrived yesterday.
Okay, very cool. I've been talking about you quite a bit.
Yes.
Especially about
All
how you
bad
punctuate sentences.
You've been talking about me swearing, haven't you?
Yeah, a little bit. I
Just
like
a
it.
little bit.
So did
You gotta fucking stop. Oh, sorry. You gotta fucking stop that.
So did you want to present something?
Yeah, sure. Do you mind?
Please.
Do you want to sit with me and hang out?
I'll be right back.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about starting global businesses, but starting them locally. I guess for folks who don't know me, my name is Dave McClure. I run a small venture capital fund in Silicon Valley called 500 Startups. What's a little bit different about my fund is we've invested in 70 companies this year. We'll probably do about 75 to 100 next year. But they're mostly small investments. About 2/3 of those are in Silicon Valley, but we've actually done 4 investments in Asia and 4 investments in the UK. And I've started to learn a few things about doing businesses internationally that I maybe will share with you and see if you find anything useful. So the initial observation I would make is that there's a ton of people available to you online. Around the world, there's probably 1.5 billion to 2 billion people on the web. There's maybe 3 billion people on mobile phones, possibly 4. So there's a lot of people online. That being said, your best business to get started with is probably the market that's close to you at home, and I'll explain why for a couple of reasons. So some things that are happening globally that I think do matter. There are more young people and more old people online than ever before. In particular, this device, iPad, there's probably going to be about 45 million units of the iPad sold next year. I'm sure in the next few years there'll be hundreds of millions of these types of devices around the world. And I've bought one of these for my mom. I bought 2 of these for my kids. And I think what's really interesting is that my 2-year-old daughter, I guess now she's 3, but she started playing with an iPhone when she was 2, and it's a very intuitive and natural device for her. When you watch her play with it, she can draw, she can use it. And my mom and even my wife's grandmother, who's 92, are starting to use online devices en masse. Interestingly, in Japan, maybe a 1/3 of the population is over 60. A lot of those people will be online in the future years. So I think that although we've been designing primarily for a lot of people in the 25 to 45-year-old segment, there's a huge market opportunity for people who are both very young, and let's say starting at 3 to 5, up to 15, and very old. There's people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s who are going to be online. And maybe they're not the most savvy of users, but they actually have a lot of disposable income to spend. And the time that they spend online, they probably have way more available time to spend than most other people. So thinking about how you can create businesses that reach both young and older people, and then use different devices than we've been used to before, and different applications as well. Obviously, there's more bandwidth and more video online than ever before. No commentary about the availability of online porn. But we can design a lot different types of applications. One thing that I don't think most people are as aware of, or at least in the US, is how global language is changing. And specifically, if you think about the combination of percentage of users online, their available spend, and the language or languages that they're used to using, and then the combinations of those 3 things, and then the growth of those 3 things over time. So interestingly, right now, as both native and non-native speakers, there are 2 languages in the world that are 1 billion speakers or more, Mandarin and English. But there's actually 4 or 5 languages that are 500 million speakers, in particular Spanish, Hindi, Arabic, and Portuguese. And the growth of Arabic, at the very least, is considerably strong. Hindi might be relatively fragmented, so I'm not sure if that's always the same sort of large market opportunity or a lot of different little market opportunities. But I think Spanish and Arabic in particular are going to be interesting world languages in the future. And if you care about Brazil, obviously Portuguese as well. So those specific languages, those 6 languages are really interesting. And then other languages that are maybe 50 million users or more, whether or not they're growing languages or whether they're declining languages, with high populations online and high number of spend. So a couple of examples that might be Japanese, Korean, German, Italian, Russian. So a lot of languages that actually have maybe 50 to 100 million users online, the populations themselves may not be growing very much, but the online spend and percentage of actual online spend in those languages is dramatic. If you're interested in any of these stats, a company we're investors in Japan called MyGengo, which actually means my language, has an interesting white paper on trends in global market growth. So another thing that's an interesting trend to think about is, in particular, Chinese and Indian populations. Probably the top 10% of those two populations are really actually similar in many ways to other more developed economies. And both online and in real life, that's the IRL part, those populations are going to spend a lot of money. Here's an interesting thing. I bet you do know that probably a lot of people from other countries come to the US or go to many other countries to go to university. But someone was telling me recently that many Chinese parents are starting to think about sending their middle school and high school kids to the US for boarding school to learn, right? And I was completely unaware of this fact, but when you start thinking about that, that's actually probably millions of people coming to boarding school in the US or in other places around the world. So if you were to start a boarding school specifically targeting and being friendly to Chinese people who want to send their kids to school, you might be able to make a lot of money. If you are doing businesses, online businesses that appeal to those segments of populations, and that you understand how to speak their languages and you understand how to design in their language, and I don't mean just that you kind of understand, but that you understand very specifically, and that you are native in fluency in those languages. You can develop businesses locally in your own country that appeal to people all over the world. And this is the trend that I'm sort of talking about, where you're seeing global trends, but you're doing local market hacks that make those audiences and populations aware of you and your business. I think we've talked a little bit about smart device proliferation, obviously on the phone and the tablet device, but I think you'll also see TVs and game consoles becoming internet aware, and maybe even other things that we didn't think about as being the likely internet devices as well. Global payments. So in the US and the EU, payment online is pretty common, but in other parts of the world, it's not so common. However, with, again, the proliferation of mobile devices and billing through mobile carriers, and even actually the adoption of online payment systems and credit cards around the world, that market is growing as well. So although we've had the ability to reach people around the world, the ability to monetize those people around the world is changing quite rapidly. And then on dramatically reduced costs. So I think most people know that building internet businesses has come down in cost quite considerably. That probably started happening about 10 years ago. So product development costs for hardware, for software, and for bandwidth started really decreasing between 2000 and 2005 to the point where now most internet businesses in their first 6 to 12 months, the significant cost structure is really headcount. However, the other part of this is that customer acquisition, particularly via online distribution platforms, has dramatically become easier, lower in cost, or at least more predictable in ways that you can acquire customers. So if you are developing for an online markets, you can now reach billions of people online, and understanding how specifically to get those customers is a much lower cost activity. So me as a venture capitalist, the historic reasons that venture capital existed were primarily for product development and for customer acquisition. Those two things were tremendously expensive, usually long cycle time activities. In today's world, they're actually short cycle time and low cost activities. And that starts to change the way that we think about investing in startups. So we don't actually have to write very large checks for a small number of businesses. We can actually write many, many, many small checks for those businesses. And as they get up the curve of certain milestones in achieving product viability and then market testing for size and monetization, you can gradually increase the investment in each of those areas. But in just the US, in the last 5 years, there's probably 5 or 6 platforms where 100 million users are available that didn't used to be. So Facebook, YouTube, a bunch of other environments, Twitter. You can reach people on all these different online channels that were not really viable market techniques before. Search, social, and mobile platforms. Really, the marketing job for most businesses, not just startups, but for most businesses, has dramatically changed in the last 5 years in a positive way. And so now, as an internet entrepreneur, you actually have global distribution platforms online. They may still be limited based on specific language issues and geography, and in some cases, payment and currency enablement. But you can sit wherever you want in the world, as long as you've got a fat pipe and access to talent, you can build a global business in your own backyard and access these customers and these distribution platforms. So let's think about how we want to go after those markets. I think you really have to start at home. I mean, unless you're living in a country where there's a very small number of users in your local geography, people overestimate the possibility of succeeding in larger markets, and they underestimate the value of succeeding in your own local market. Particularly, I've talked to a number of entrepreneurs in France and Japan that I think really look down on their own local markets. They really think that their own local market is not as interesting as the global market. And I think they're being a little naive. One is because their local language proficiency is so important, right? Their ability to understand languages in larger global markets where they're not the native language speaker is tremendously challenging. And I'm not saying people can't do it, but if you're going to do that, go to those markets, right? So if you're going to develop for the US and Chinese markets, move to those fucking markets. Don't try and waste your time here, right? Learn those languages. Be in those countries. Meet those people. Live with those people. Understand the idiom and expression and comedy and entertainment that they have. You have to be in those markets 24/7 to understand them, or at least experiencing them, via visual, images, entertainment, the things that they experience, right? But still, they are big markets locally, even if you're only 30 to 50 million users online. Right? So the other point that I make is big enough markets are really, 1 million users. If you can go after 1 million customers who will pay you $20 a month, congratulations, you've got a $250 million a year business. So I think that the venture capital historically has been very myopic in looking only for billion-dollar markets. But the fact of the matter is it costs much less money to build those businesses and acquire those customers. So you don't really need, as much as was previously required before, large amounts of capital to build these businesses. It's still very important to understand both language and visual design, though. Highly recommend, if you have not read these books, Spent by Jeffrey Miller. Fascinating book on how behavioral biology evolution influences marketing. So the title of his book talks about sex, consumer marketing, and evolutionary biology, and how that impacts what we understand. Influence, the Psychology Persuasion by Richard Cialdini. Historically been around for 20 years, but really how the psychology of the brain impacts us. And then less familiar book to many of you, Understanding Comics, is a book that really describes the combination of static image and text. And this is really how I think we experience the web. We experience it via images and text, and those combinations are incredibly powerful. For most people who are geeks and developing online, we think about code, and we think about lines of code and how we have features, but really the promise of the experience is delivered to you through visual images and through text descriptions that influence our emotions. I am a big fan of actually selling something online. I don't think most people really pay attention to that enough. It's actually quite easy to provide something of value to people and get them to pay you for it. Obviously, free still works, and there are models such as freemium and delivering different content to those users, which is going to be useful to them, and maybe it's useful to you if those free users invite other users, or if the participation of free users actually increases the data or the activity. You have a network model there. Or maybe it gives them an opportunity to try out your product before you buy it. But ultimately, you should be trying to sell people something online in order to make your business viable. So I'm not a big fan of advertising, although there are very many advertising businesses which are successful. But you can be successful with a much smaller number of customers where you're selling them something direct via transaction, subscription, virtual goods, or if you're not selling them something, identifying certain purchase behavior, data, usually age, sex, and location that's valuable to someone else. And lastly, I would say you don't need to be in Silicon Valley. It's really, I think too many people outside Silicon Valley feel like that's Mecca and that's where you need to go. And there are many things in Silicon Valley that are very important. Mostly ideas. There are tons of people there. There are tons of experienced entrepreneurs and capital and universities. But really, Silicon Valley is something that is experienced more in the head and the heart, than in the physical world. And that can be experienced anywhere in the world. So you don't need Silicon Valley, and you don't need to be in Silicon Valley, but you need that ethic and that experience and that imagination to be in you wherever you are in the world. So with that, I would say start your business local, but feel like hustling global, because the world is a huge opportunity for you. Start at home, but build it globally. Thanks.